So it's part 2 of lesson 4. We've gotten did our first page where we're using some dynamic data. We've replaced the mock genres we had last week with actual data. Now, from a presentation point of view, I'd say we have one small issue here. What's the problem from a user interface perspective with this page? Okay, well, yes, we can argue about whether it looks good or not. That's somewhat subjective, but there's a bit of a functionality issue. Our data's here. I would suggest the data is not exactly presented in the ideal way. Why not? What would be a better way to show this same data?
Nav bar. Like a straight horizontal rather than vertical.
Okay, well, we could put it in the nav bar, but that could become an issue because if that list becomes unlimited, the nav bar may not be the right place for it. But what if we have like 50 genres? What order is this presented in? Yeah, it's not in, doesn't appear to be in any sort of order. It is in an order. How are these records ordered by? Yeah, they're ordered by the ID, right? Which isn't readily apparent. But if we don't specify, whenever we run a query, it will automatically order things by the primary key. But for display purposes, this isn't very useful. It would be better to alphabetize this list. So we want to modify this a little bit. So rather than just grabbing the list and displaying them based on genre ID, which is meaningless to the user, we're better off to make this list alphabetized. So we can modify this a little bit. So I'm going to take this out. And we're going to use this query syntax that Microsoft developed that's called LINQ, L-I-N-Q. They came out with it, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. It stands for Language Independent Network Query. So the idea is it looks like SQL, but we can use it not only for writing queries against SQL data sources, but against any kind of data source. Could even be a text file, an XML document, JSON, anything. So I'll just delete what's here. So we start with I'll give an alias called G. So we're going to select from our genre model. And we can add an order by. So it's very similar, sort of in a few things. The select goes at the end. So we're aliasing our list of our genre model. Order by, we could put in a where clause, which we'll do later, but we don't need a where clause here because we want all the records. So if we build again, so if I build this now and refresh my view, my list should be sorted alphabetically by genre name instead. So this is a better list. Notice we haven't made a single change at all to the view, right? First we changed from mock data to real data, and now we've changed the ordering by ID to ordering by the name. We haven't even opened up our store index view, because all the logic here is the same. So we've separated out what goes on in our logic layer from what goes on in our presentation layer. As long as our view is expecting a list of type genres, this code is going to work, as long as that's what gets passed in. So we're going to change our browse method as well. We're going to leave what's here. So when I click on any genre, it takes me to browse and it shows me what we've selected. But what we want to do in this case is we want to show the selected genre, but we also want to display all of the related albums, all of the child data. Click the category, show all the data inside that category. So we won't use the view bag for this. I'm going to comment this out. Because we said last week, the view bag, we can use it to pass information, but it will pass an untyped object. And we really, as much as possible, we want to be passing strongly typed objects so we have access to their properties and methods. So we'll create, in this case, just a single genre object because we don't need a list. But not only do we want the genre that's selected, we want to include all the related child data, all of the albums in the selected genre. And now here, because we're selecting only one record, we also need a where clause. We don't want all the genres. We want whichever one the user clicked on the previous page. Now you can put this all on one line or not. So this is how we set up a where clause. .where. Whoops, sorry. We can use .where. I'm going to use this instead. We're expecting a single record, so we can use one of these methods, single. I prefer this one, single or default. Because when we call single, meaning we're expecting a single record, if nothing matches, it'll throw an error. If we use single or default, it'll hand us back an empty object if that record isn't found, so it'll prevent an error. So we'll use single or default, and now we need to set up the criteria. Which genre record do we want? So we're going to use another syntax you may have seen before, maybe, maybe not. Which is what's known as, anybody seen this kind of operator before? What's it called? Got a couple different names for it. So these are what's called lambda expressions or fat arrow functions. Either one. We can take a second to talk about these. We're going to use them for our where clauses. These aren't particular to C#. We'll see them in Java. Basically, a lambda expression, it's an anonymous function. So for example, this would work in any language. So we declare n is an input parameter, so it's represented as an anonymous function. But we don't have to write it as a separate function. We just declare our parameter and give it a value. I should probably include this link up here. So what we want to do is take the genre name and use that as a parameter to filter out that one genre in our query. So here's what it looks like. So we define some parameter, I'll just call it G, and we use our fat arrow function. So we want to set the g.name equal to our incoming parameter in our browse method. Whatever genre gets passed in the URL, we want to pass that as our name. Whoops. I can't use the same variable name here as my parameter. So I'll do it this way. So my selected genre is the database, the genre from the database with that name. So this should give us the selected genre record as well as all the related album child data. And now when we return the view, we need to pass this genre object.
So basically our controller class is talking to our model class, and then the model class will send the request to our view, and then
the model class doesn't send the request to the view.
sorry, the controller. The controller method.
Yeah, so we can kind of look at it visually and map the diagram with what happens in MVC, right? So the root is /store/browse genre equals rock, right? That's the root. So the dispatcher hands that to the controller, and it calls our browse method and passes in some string, right? Our controller uses the model to run a query and also passes in that genre as the parameter to the query. So this is the equivalent of running an SQL select star from genre where name equals our parameter.
If you have the breakpoint, then the line which you are on, then it will have a data of all the.
Yeah, I'll try it. I'll turn the debugger on. That's a good point, and we'll try it. So not only select the genre, but also do a join to the albums table to get any related albums. So the model then, if that query is successful, it hands back, it populates this in-memory genre object. We're instantiating an instance of a genre object. So the model will run the query. If it finds something, it will populate this object. And then we load the view called browse, and we hand it, we say, here's the data that you need to display to the user on the browse view. So we can run it to here. I'll actually do that. So if I put a breakpoint in and start with the only thing as good as having 2 different browsers open is 3 different browsers open. So I click on store and choose. So it calls, the dispatcher calls browse. The input parameter from the URL said rock. When I mouse over selected genre, right now it's empty. So if I hit F11, so genre is rock. So when I hit F11 again, so we can see what it actually does. It calls the genre model. And now it no longer is null, and I can inspect. Whoops. I hit the wrong thing. Whoops. There, let me do it again. I'll refresh my page.
You can overload the view.
Yeah, so it loads the view. I'll just refresh it again. So selected genre is null. Now if I expand it here, we can see the properties that it fetched. Name, and it also included all the related albums. It tells me there are 111 related records in this object, and if I expand, I can actually see them. So here's album ID 398 with the title, Speak of the Devil by this. And notice it even includes the artist. So it includes the child data. So this album has, so all of that's going to get included. So it loads the view. Now we haven't done anything on the view. We're handing the view that object with all the data, but now we need to modify the view to actually display that list. So I need to stop my debugger. And now we want to modify our store browse view. So let's open that. So right now, all this does is show the name of the genre. It doesn't show anything else. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add a model declaration. We need to indicate what kind of object is this page expecting. Right? We did it on our index view last week. We declared a model. So what we need on the browse is going to be really similar, except there's going to be one thing different about this line. We can't use exactly this line. What will we modify from our index in terms of the model declaration on browse? What type of object are we going to display on the browse page? What kind of object are we passing in our controller? Even though we used var, Visual Studio, you can see in blue, types the object. What type of object are we handing back? Yeah, we're handing an object of type genre. In this case, we handed a list of genres. So we have a reference to our genre model here, but we declared it as IEnumerable, meaning we're handing a list or a collection back. On this page, are we using one genre object or a list of them? Yeah, just one, whatever the selected genre is. So we'll declare our model. But in this case, it's not, doesn't have that, it's not declared as IEnumerable because it's one single object, not a list of objects. So the only difference here, this is wrapped in this IEnumerable with the angled brackets, not on this page. So we don't actually need to use the view bag because we have the genre. So we can delete that. And now you notice this property is strongly typed. So we have access to the genre name. We can also see here that we have the list of albums, which we're going to output in a loop. So we don't really need the view bag. We're accessing that genre object directly. So let's create a table. We use Bootstrap to create alternating row backgrounds. We'll put on a header row. And 3 columns for title, artist, and price. I guess instead of saying browse for genre, this should say albums for, where we want to display the genre name and then the list of albums that belong to it. So let's try it just like this, and we just want to make sure the genre name still shows up now that we're not using the view bag, and that we get a table heading. The table's empty. We'll populate it in a minute. So we're no longer using the view bag. I've commented it out. So I'm going to build. And I'll go back, just try this out in the browser again. Because I stopped debugging, I shut my server down, so I need to restart it again. So I did start without debugging to restart it. We get an error here because it's going straight to the browse page. I need to go through my index first to pick. So now, instead of using the view bag, it's pulling the name from our model, and we've got an empty table so far. So we're going to need to use a loop to populate our table rows. So we'll use the for each syntax. So notice our model is strongly typed. So what do I want to pick here? Which property of the model do we want to use? What do we want to display in the table? Yeah. So we want to loop through the albums. Sorry, Jeff, you're one step ahead of me. So we want to loop through the albums. So for each one here, now we can just output a dot title. Then we can create, the next column's a little different. So here, notice there's now a one-to-many relationship between album and artist. Every album has an artist. So when I type at a dot, we get artist dot, what property do we want here? Which property should we pick from this? Yeah, we want the name. And lastly, we want a dot price. So by using this model and passing in a strongly typed object, we have access to all the properties of that object as well as any related objects. So we don't have to build, we don't have to change anything in the controller because our logic's already done. Now we should just be able to refresh. There's our table. Again, if we wanted to add an order by, we could if we wanted to sort. So instead of having to write join statements, we just use an include, and it will include any related child data automatically in our object. And our MVC structure means our code on our view is very light, right? There's no logic here. There's no big chunk of server-side code that has to do with fetching and formatting our data. That stuff lives in the controller. And the controller does all the logic and says to the view, here you go, show this stuff. Stays behind the scenes. The last thing we could actually do is we could add a little formatting here, so we could format this as currency. So we've got some string formats. So we're going to call the format method of the .NET string library, which would look like this. I'll call string.format. Currency format looks like this. In curly braces, a 0, meaning our first value, colon, lowercase c. So that's the format. And the second parameter is the value we're formatting, which is our price. So this should format those prices as currency. Again, no need to recompile. We're just changing the HTML in the view. So there's currency, there's other date and time formats where I think a short date is, for example, :D. If we had a date and time and we wanted the time to be hidden, we could use D for a short date. I think that's what we need. Yeah, so now we've got currency format. So MVC allows us to separate these concerns, right? Our logic, our data. So all the data is handled by the models, which we've auto-generated. The logic is in our controllers and the presentation is in our views.
I just saw that if you go back to your, it's showing dollar in front of the price. But what if we are in another country and you want to show?
It uses your local settings, so you can change. You'd have to set the localization settings for the application, which you can overwrite. So it won't always do $. It depends, basically depends on the settings of the web server. It will use local settings or you can override those. Okay. The other thing is, I think your other option is, I think there's another parameter we could set here. Let's just see. Yes, so I think in the string.format method, there's other parameters where, and one of those parameters is you could specify the currency code of the currency you want, and it would be different. Excuse me, I think that's actually the easiest way. Good question. Visual Studio also actually tells us, this is kind of neat, because we have this application insights on, it tells us how many times this method's been run and how many of them failed and how fast, which is kind of neat. Okay. It also tracks how many times it's been changed. So it even tracks our changes from last week and the week before. And which commit it was in.
Could you go back to the browse for just
Sure.
Creating the top, the header.
So this declaration is critical. Without this, we don't have access to that object at all. Line 5 tells our view what kind of object we're working with and whether it's a single object or whether it's a collection of related objects. So we'll see this on almost all of our views. If we go and look at the completed source code, which we can find online, if you just look for MVC Music Store. It's on Codeplex, although I think that site's coming down. It won't be there very long. We can actually see the completed source code for the whole music store. So if we look in on some of the views, for example, on shopping cart, actually not there. So in our store manager, like on our index, right? The model here is album and it's IEnumerable. So this view is going to receive a list of albums as the data from the controller. And this looks fairly similar to what we've done, looping through the model. So most of our views, so on our address and payment, it's going to take an order model. It's not IEnumerable because it's one order at a time when we're checking it. So this is what allows our view to be able to interact with a particular model class and access its properties and its methods. So these views, we hand created these. We created this controller ourselves. The index method is written for us and the index view is created. We wrote the browse method and created the browse view. So we kind of hand coded all this. I want to show you an easier way of doing it, and this is what I want you to do for your assignment. So we're going to try using the scaffold. So for this, go up in your Solution Explorer to Controllers, right-click, and we're going to add a new controller. Now, when we created the store controller last week, we picked this. We picked empty controller. But instead of that, we want this option, an MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. So it will create all the actions and views for doing create, read, update, delete, and list. So let's pick that. The first thing it wants to know is what model does this controller interact with? So we'll pick the genre model. What's the data class? That's our music store model. We want it to generate the views, asking what template should the views use. So we can just click our little browse button and go into views and shared and pick our layout template. These views should use the same template as the rest of the site. And it will automatically give it a name. If we pick the genre model, it will name it genres controller, which is good. And just click your add button. It will build the genres controller, and it will build 5 views inside of a new subfolder of views called genres. So let's click add, and it will scaffold all this stuff. So here's our controller. It references our models, just like we did it manually in our store controller. It creates an instance of our connection, and it writes all the code for us to do our create, read, update, and delete. Here's our index method, details, 2 versions of create. We have a get, which will display an empty form, and we've got a post that checks for cross-site scripting attack. So in other words, it will only accept the form post from our same domain. It won't allow a user from another domain to post data to our form. And it will include these 3 fields, and then it will add a new genre and call save changes. That's it. There's no more laying out like we did in PHP. Get this field from this box, and this field from this box, and this field from this box, and then insert them all. We just say bind the fields, call add and save changes and redirect. That's it. Here's our edit. Load the edit page. This genre based on the ID. If it can't find it, return an error. Otherwise, return the selected object, process an update, do a delete. Dispose of the class. So we can change any of these. Like, if we want this list to be alphabetized, we could add the same code we put in our store controller to use an order by. And if we look at views, it created a genres folder, and here are all the views. So here's our index view. We'll look at what this looks like in the browser. So I'm just going to compile. I'll build the solution. We'll check it out in the browser, and then we can have a look at some of these views. Now, there's no direct link here, but if I just browse to genres, it will load my genres index view. Scaffolding built. So the index view automatically includes all the columns. It hides the ID column, and it gives us links to the create view. And these are actually functional. So if I create one, there it is. I can edit. It works. I can delete. And it's gone. So this is a much, much, much faster way of getting our application set up. I had one student yesterday say, why the heck didn't you teach us this in semester 2? Well, because we need to teach you what you're doing. So we make you do things manually. So then we can put these tools in your hands that automate things. If we didn't make you do it manually, you wouldn't have any idea what any of this was doing, nor how to make changes. So these are usually not really production ready, right? There's a couple of obvious issues with this one. The first one I would say is putting this description column here is kind of useless. It makes the page kind of unwieldy. So by default, when you use scaffolding or index view, it's going to include every column. And you may have lots of columns in the table. We don't really need to show necessarily every column in this list. So if we want to get rid of this description, we can now customize the view that got scaffolded. So let's do that. So if you open up your views genres index, let's get rid of the description heading. So here lines 18, 19, and 20. Let's delete those. Let's also delete this line here, sorry, this section here. So here where it says display for description. We don't want to show the description on this page. It's too big. So let's get rid of lines 26, 27, and 28 as well. So now I've got one column heading, 2 columns. I'm going to add also some text here. I don't like that they've left that last column heading empty. To me, it looks weird. So I'm going to add a hard-coded heading here that says actions. That'll be the heading above my edit, details, and delete links. So we use the scaffolding as a starting point to build the views, and then we change them so that they actually look and function the way we want them to. Same thing with the controller methods. We let the scaffolding build them, and then we customize them. So now when I refresh the page, that's better. My actions heading is here, and we've hidden the description column, which doesn't need to be there.
So what if you go to store?
We haven't changed the store at all. We haven't made any changes to the store.
For assignment purpose, if you want to fields of, then we have.
Okay, let me come back to the assignment. So for the assignment, this is what you have to do. You don't have to hand create controllers or views. You have to build 2 tables in the database, use the entity framework to generate 2 models based on those 2 tables. Then you can use the scaffolding to build your controllers and views. And then you simply need to get rid of these links and add links to the index view for each of your tables. Okay. You don't have to modify the views at all, but you have to add links to them so I can find them. Okay. So if you've created a schools and a students table, you'll scaffold a students controller and a schools controller with views, and then you'll put a schools link and a students link. And each one will link to the index view. So these views are functional, but we just modify them as we see fit. But this is a great starting point. So we don't have to waste time creating all this CRUD code and creating the views from scratch every time. Let the scaffold generate it as a starting point, and then we make whatever changes we want. So in the index, and we'll talk about this, I'm actually going to show you the create form. So here's our form. Notice it's got this anti-forgery token, so that'll prevent cross-site posts. It's got a validation summary. So if there are errors, it will print them at the top. So here, if I go to create, oh, I guess it allowed me to do an empty one. So rather than using an input, it uses this editor for. So what this does is it inspects, and here we can see another one of these lambda expressions. It inspects the name property, which it knows is a string, and then Visual Studio guesses what, if it's a string data type, it will generate by default a single line text box. If this is a bit field, sorry, if it's a Boolean field, it'll generate a checkbox instead. So it will intelligently try to scaffold the right controls. But sometimes we'll have to change them. Right? Maybe we want a drop-down list from a child table. So we'll have to put that in. And it even includes validation with a Bootstrap class. So it'll print those error messages in red if I break any validation rules. We'll look at input validation, I think, next week. So again, we can customize, make any changes to the form that we want. So in your assignment, you need 10 views, but you don't have to build any of them. You just say, create a controller and scaffold the views, and it will create the 5 views for each controller. And then you're just going to link to them in the top. Okay. So what we're going to want to do next week is look at things like validations and data annotations. So meaning, for example, in our model, if we want to put something like an alias, a friendly name, so it's called genre name in the database, but when we build our form, we want it to in the model. So we're going to look at doing some of those things next week. I'm going to do one more quick thing today. One of the things you need for your assignment, as I said, you need a README file that explains your application, includes a link to your site, and also lists any third-party CSS you used or any bonus features you've added. So I know that they're there. So before I push this up, I'm going to make a README file right in my solution. So I'm just going to add a new item here. Not sure if README was here. Guess not. I'll just call it readme.md, MD for Markdown. So we can put regular HTML in here.
Are we okay to create it in that GitHub then?
Yes, but if you do it online, you're then going to have to do a pull because then your local repository is out of sync. So you can do it on GitHub. I'm just going to do it here so that way when I push, the README gets included with my push. Just put in a little description. So I'll just go to my Azure portal and find the link, and I'll include it in my README. Where's my Thursday? So I'm just going to Oh, that's my database. Whoops. Music Store Thursday. So I'll push this up to Git in a minute. We can see the README. So I'll copy that URL in here. So you should put some kind of README for your assignment. Again, if somebody goes to look, you put it in your portfolio, they go to your Git repo, the README tells them kind of what you've done. So now I can just go back to my command prompt. So this part of the lesson, we scaffolded and we've added the README file. So also, when you add the README, rather than just seeing all the code, the directory listing on GitHub, the README file is what shows up instead. So now I've pushed, so it should look something like this. So now the README is here. So as soon as somebody comes to the repository, they can see what the application's all about, and I've got a link. So I want you to use this. This is part of your source control marks for the assignment, is making sure you include this. Okay. There are probably a few people who need help. We've got a bit of time, so I will stick around if you need help. But other than I need help, are there any questions that anybody has that I should answer before I stop the video stream about anything we've done today? I mean, a question other than mine isn't working.
For the setting of the firewall, I have to set up each and every time. So what will be the...
Each and every time for the same database?
Like I have two database, so...
Yeah, so you need to set it up. When you create the database, you need to set it the firewall rule.
So it will be all 4 times 0 and 4 times 25.
Yep.
So it will be used for each and every...
Yeah, because those databases, there's no connection. If you set the firewall on one and you create another database, that firewall rule only lives on the first one. It does not get copied to your next database. So you have to set that access up individually, just like you set up a new username and password for every database, right? You don't have the same credential that has access to both. Any other questions before I stop the video stream for today? So your assignments due Wednesday night. I suggest starting sooner rather than later. A, while today's lesson's still fresh in your mind, and B, that way if you have problems, you can come get help before it's due next week.